It was December 1979, and New York City was buried under a relentless sheet of gray slush and biting wind. Inside the back of a black limousine, moving slowly down Fifth Avenue, Frank Sinatra sat in silence, staring out at the blurred lights of the city that had crowned him king, then cast him aside, and then crowned him again. He was 64 years old, preparing for the most ambitious album of his later life, the Trilogy Project, but the silence inside the car felt heavier than usual. To the world, he was the chairman of the board, the man who had it all, the voice that defined a century. But in the quiet of his own mind, in the wee, small hours he sang about so often, he was haunted by the faces of those he had lost and the ghosts of the lean years when the phone stopped ringing. As the car idled at a red light near a row of grimy storefronts on 8th Avenue, Frank saw something that made him tap on the partition glass. "Hold it here, Tony," he said, his voice a low rasp that commanded instant obedience. Outside a pawn shop, shivering in a thin coat that was no match for a New York winter, a young woman was arguing with a shop owner, clutching a small, velvet-wrapped object to her chest, as if it contained the last beat of her heart. Frank didn't just see a stranger. He saw a desperation he remembered from the streets of Hoboken 50 years ago. He opened the door, stepping out into the biting cold, his breath pluming in the air. What happened next would not make the headlines, but it would reveal the true soul of the man behind the tuxedo. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Frank adjusted the collar of his heavy wool coat and walked toward the pawnshop entrance. The wind whipped around him, carrying the sounds of honking taxis and the distant wail of a siren. But Frank moved with that distinctive, prowling grace that had commanded stages from Las Vegas to London. The shop owner, a man with a face like crumpled paper, was shouting at the girl, trying to intimidate her into a lowball deal. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 20, looked on the verge of collapsing. She was holding a silver cigarette case, its metal dull from age but clearly precious. Frank stopped a few feet away, lighting a cigarette with a gold lighter, the snap of the flame cutting through the noise of the argument. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, the smoke curling around the brim of his fedora, letting his presence fill the space. The shop owner looked up, ready to yell at the intruder, but the words died in his throat. You didn't need to be a fan to recognize those blue eyes. They were eyes that had seen everything. Eyes that could be warm as a summer sky or cold as a loaded gun. "Is there a problem here?" Frank asked. The volume of his voice was low, conversational, but it carried a weight that made the shop owner take a step back. The girl turned, her eyes wide, red-rimmed from crying, shock registering on her frozen face. She looked from the shop owner to the man in the fedora, unable to process that Frank Sinatra was standing on a dirty sidewalk in Hell's Kitchen. He said he'd give me $50, she stammered, her voice shaking from the cold. "But my father said it was worth more. He said it was a gift." Frank stepped closer and gently extended a gloved hand. "May I?" She hesitated for a second, then placed the silver case in his palm. Frank turned it over. Engraved on the back, almost worn away by time, were the words, "To Eddie for keeping the beat. FS 1943. Frank felt a physical jolt in his chest. The year 1943, the Paramount Theater, the riots of Bobby Soxers. The world was on fire with war, and he was the match that lit the fuse of pop culture. He remembered Eddie. Eddie wasn't a star. He wasn't a soloist. He was a drummer in the house band at a club in Jersey before the fame truly hit. A guy who had loaned Frank $10 when Frank didn't have a dime for a sandwich. A guy who had shared a cigarette in the alley when the managers were screaming. "Your father is Eddie Miller?" Frank asked, looking up from the case. The girl nodded, tears finally spilling over. "He's sick, Mr. Sinatra. He's in the hospital in Queens. We lost the insurance last month. I didn't know what else to do." Frank closed his hand over the case, feeling the cold metal warm up against his skin. He looked at the pawn shop owner, who was now sweating despite the freezing temperature. $50? Frank said, a dangerous smile touching the corner of his lips. "You were going to give the daughter of a friend of mine $50 for a piece of history?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the girl. "Keep the case, kid. You're coming with me. If stories about hidden kindness move you, please subscribe for new stories." They didn't go to a fancy restaurant. Frank knew that would only make her uncomfortable. Instead, he guided her into a warm, brightly lit diner a few blocks away, the kind of place that smelled of roasting coffee and grease, the smell of the New York he grew up in. He ordered her a burger and a hot chocolate, and for himself, just black coffee. Her name was Sarah. As the warmth of the diner returned the color to her cheeks, she told him the story, and it was a story Frank had heard too many times. Her father, Eddie, had played in jazz clubs for 40 years, never famous, just a working musician. But the gigs had dried up as rock and roll took over, and then the arthritis took his hands, and finally, the cancer took his strength. Now he was in a crowded ward in a state hospital. hospital, and they were threatening to discharge him because the bills were unpaid. Sarah had dropped out of college to work 2 waitress jobs, but it wasn't enough. The cigarette case was the last thing of value they owned. Frank listened, his face unreadable, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup. He was thinking about the unfairness of it all. He was thinking about how thin the line was between the man sitting in the limousine and the man dying in a charity ward. He had been down, he had been out. In the early 50s, when his voice failed and the studios dropped him, he had walked these same streets wondering if he could afford dinner. He knew the taste of fear. He looked at Sarah, seeing the exhaustion etched under her young eyes, and he felt a surge of protective anger. He still plays? In his head, I mean? Frank asked quietly. Sarah smiled sadly. All the time. He talks about the old arrangements, the Dorsey days. He told me he loaned you money for a train ticket once. Frank chuckled, a soft, genuine sound. He did, and he never let me pay him back. Said to buy him a drink when I made it big. I guess I'm late on that drink. But what Sarah didn't know was that Frank was already moving pieces on a chessboard she couldn't see. He excused himself to use the payphone in the back. He didn't call his manager. He didn't call his publicist. He called his personal lawyer, a man known for fixing problems that couldn't be fixed. I need a private room at Mount Sinai, Frank barked into the receiver, shielding his mouth with his hand. Top specialists tonight, and I need the mortgage on a house in Queens paid off. I don't care who holds the paper. Buy it. He paused, listening to the lawyer's stammering questions about costs. Did I ask you how much? I said do it, and listen to me. Nobody knows it's me. You tell them it's an anonymous grant from the Musicians Union. If this leaks to the press, you're fired. He hung up the phone with a force that rattled the coin slot. When he walked back to the table, he was humming a few bars of One for My Baby. He sat down and looked at Sarah. Finish your burger. Then my driver is going to take you to the hospital to see your dad. You might find that the doctors have reconsidered his situation. Sarah looked at him, confused. Mr. Sinatra, I can't take your money. I just wanted to sell the case. Frank reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. His hand was manicured, bearing a heavy gold ring, but his grip was callous and strong. You're not taking my money, Sarah. You're letting me pay back a debt. Your father invested in me when I was a nobody. Consider this the dividend. He pulled a pen from his pocket and grabbed a paper napkin. He wrote a phone number on it. If anyone gives you trouble, anyone, you call this number. It rings on my desk. You don't talk to a secretary. You talk to me. Sarah began to cry again, silent tears that slid down her face. Why? She whispered. You don't even know us. Frank stood up, buttoning his coat, the mask of the legend slipping back into place. I know enough, he said. I know that talent is cheap, but loyalty is rare. Your dad was loyal. He tipped his hat, dropped $100 bill on the table for a $2 meal, and walked out into the snow before she could say another word. But the story didn't end there. In fact, the most incredible part was yet to happen. We have many more tales of legends and their secret lives coming up, so make sure to subscribe for new stories. 2 days later, Eddie Miller was transferred to a private suite at one of the best hospitals in New York. The doctors, who had previously been unavailable, were suddenly attentive and thorough. The outstanding mortgage on their small house in Queens was marked paid in full by a shell corporation that couldn't be traced. Sarah tried to tell her father that it was a grant, but the old drummer, weak as he was, knew better. One afternoon, a massive bouquet of yellow roses arrived at the hospital room. There was no card, just a small note tucked inside that read, "For the train ticket, Francis." Eddie held that note for hours, a smile on his face that Sarah hadn't seen in years. He passed away 3 weeks later, but he died with dignity, in comfort, knowing his daughter had a roof over her head. Frank Sinatra never spoke of it publicly. He didn't use it for a photo op. He didn't mention it in his biography. That was the code of the generation he came from. You do the favor, and you keep your mouth shut. But Frank kept tabs. Oh, he watched. Every Christmas for the next 10 years, a hamper from Dean and DeLuca would arrive at Sarah's house. No name, just happy holidays. Sarah used the stability Frank had given her to go back to school. She studied music management, driven by a desire to protect artists like her father, who had been chewed up by the industry. She worked her way up from the mailroom of a record label to become a fierce advocate for session musicians' rights. She fought for royalties, for health care, for the people in the background who made the stars shine. In 1990, Frank was celebrating his 75th birthday with a massive concert at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. It was a homecoming, a final victory lap for the kid from Hoboken. The arena was packed with thousands of people. Sarah, now a successful woman in her 30s, bought a ticket. She didn't ask for a backstage pass. She didn't try to use the private number he had given her on that napkin, which she still kept framed in her office. She just wanted to be there. She sat in the upper tier, watching the man who had saved her life command the stage. His voice was rougher now, the breath control not what it used to be, but the phrasing, the way he told the story of a song, was more powerful than ever. When he began to sing Angel Eyes, the arena went dark, lit only by a single spot spotlight on Frank and a cigarette in his hand. The silence in the room was absolute, and in that silence, Sarah felt a connection that transcended the distance between the cheap seats and the stage. She realized that Frank sang about loneliness so well because he lived it. He gave everything to the audience, everything to his friends, and kept very little for himself. The chairman of the board was a suit of armor protecting the heart of a man who remembered what it was like to be cold. As the concert ended and the applause roared like an ocean, Frank looked up toward the upper tiers. It was impossible that he could see her in the dark crowd of 20,000 faces, but for a second he paused, raised his glass of Jack Daniels in a toast to the darkness, and smiled. Sarah smiled back, tears streaming down her face, just like that night in the diner. If you are enjoying this journey into the past, please subscribe for new stories. Years passed, the world changed, grunge replaced pop, the internet replaced radio, and Frank Sinatra faded into the twilight of his years. When the news broke on May 14th, 1998, that the voice was silenced forever, the world mourned. Times Square stopped. The lights of Las Vegas were dimmed, but for Sarah, the grief was private and profound. She didn't go to the star-studded funeral in Beverly Hills. Instead, she went to a small church in Queens, the one where her father was buried. She lit a candle for Frank, placing it next to the one for her dad. A week after Frank's death, Sarah received a letter from a law firm in Los Angeles. She was confused. She had no business dealings in California. She opened the thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a letter dictated by Frank years earlier, with instructions to be delivered only after his passing. The letter was typed, but the signature was the familiar, bold scrawl of Francis Albert Sinatra. It read, "Dear Sarah, I kept an eye on you. You did good. You fought for the little guys, just like I hoped you would. Your dad would be proud. I know I am. Keep fighting. And do me a favor. Find someone else who's standing out in the cold and bring them inside. That's the only legacy that matters. Francis." Included with the letter was the silver cigarette case. Frank had kept it all those years. He hadn't just given it back that night. He had secretly bought it from himself to keep it safe, likely knowing she might try to sell it again if times got hard. He had been her safety net, invisible and silent, for 2 decades. Sarah held the case, the metal cool against her palm, and realized the full scope of what he had done. He hadn't just saved her financial future. He had given her a moral compass. He had taught her that power is useless unless it is used to lift others up. Sarah took Frank's final instruction to heart. She started a foundation in her father's name, funded by her own success and the seed money from the cigarette case, which she finally sold at auction for a record-breaking sum to a museum. The foundation provides emergency grants to aging jazz musicians who can't pay their medical bills. Every winter, on the anniversary of that night in 1979, Sarah walks the streets of New York. She looks for the buskers, the shivering artists, the people with talent in their hands and fear in their eyes. She buys them a meal. She listens to their stories. And sometimes she pays off a debt that seems impossible. When people ask her why she does it, why she spends her time on people the world has forgotten, she just smiles and touches a small gold pin on her lapel, a replica of a fedora. "Because," she tells them, "a man once taught me that nobody should have to sell their soul just to survive the winter." The legend of Frank Sinatra is usually written in gold records, movie deals, and presidential inaugurations. It is written in the headlines of gossip columns and the history books of music. But the real story, the one that tells you who he actually was, is written in the invisible moments. It is written on a napkin in a diner on 8th Avenue. It is written in the quiet dignity of a dying drummer in Queens. It is written in the life of a woman who learned that even the biggest star in the universe is not too big to care about a single shivering stranger. That is the Frank Sinatra who deserves to be remembered, not just the voice, but the heart. The man who knew that the my way wasn't about walking alone. It was about making sure that when you made it to the top, you sent the elevator back down for the next guy. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched you, subscribe for new stories to join our community. And before you go, ask yourself, who is standing in the cold right now within your reach? You don't need to be Frank Sinatra to change their life. You just need to stop, look, and listen.